This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs. And I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. Join me as I talk to women entrepreneurs about the nuts and bolts of their journeys and to experts who will give you insights that are hard to find anywhere else. Let's jump in. How can you evaluate and find the right type of support for your startup right now, whether that's an incubator or an accelerator? And what steps can you take early on to protect your interest in your startup before you ever step into one of these programs? How can you get the most bang for your accelerator buck and still build your business even after you enter the program? In this episode, Charla Triplett, Managing Director of Suncoast Ventures, gives you the lowdown on all of these questions and more. Now, for everything you always wanted to know about accelerators but were afraid to ask, here's Charla. Hey, Charla, welcome to Invisible Inc. We're so delighted to have you here today.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
So you've had a very interesting journey just from talking to you before and looking at your profile. How did you end up where you are today? Give us a little flavor of your journey.
I have a background as a scientist and engineer, and so worked for a number of years in a number of different roles, picking up different kinds of skill sets along the way. I realized pretty early on I was not cut out for the scientific and engineering research side of things. I didn't ever feel like I was going to be the one to make the inventions, like the next latest innovation. And I was really interested in things in particular that were applied. And so I had started out as a basic scientist. I moved my way into engineering, which I found was much more aligned with how I thought about things. I wanted to be able to not just find in it something that was in a textbook somewhere after 20 years of doing work, but something that actually made an impact. And I've always had an interest and a desire to do that in healthcare. The way that I've ended up becoming a VC is essentially starting by working with companies at early stage and strategy based on my background and experience from previous. And then at that point, I also realized that I needed to find ways to get them connected to capital. And so that's how I started learning about venture capital and early stage funding, and then applied my knowledge to help support my clients. And then ultimately was recruited into a venture fund that was working towards becoming a firm at some point. And that's where I met my current partner that I work with. That firm ultimately, I'm not sure where they ended up, but the two of us went on together and went into Expert Dojo. And I think from there also founded and are running Suncoast Ventures as well.
So there are two pieces of your story. There's the accelerator, which is Expert Dojo, and then there's Suncoast, which is more on the VC side. So why don't we start with Expert Dojo? What's your role in the accelerator?
Yeah, so I think technically my title is something like senior venture partner, but I really work hand in hand with Genevieve Le-Marchal, who's the head of healthcare. We do all of the diligence and all of the sort of recruiting of the companies into the accelerator. And then we work with companies to help support them along the way. So Expert Dojo is a little different than some other accelerators in terms of, I say a typical accelerator is like a very determined time period. So typically like a 3-month kind of thing, and then they're out the door. That's not how we operate at Expert Dojo. So even though we've had 3 cohorts to date, we're still actively working very closely with those companies that have come through.
One thing I really loved about Expert Dojo was your emphasis on female and diverse founders. Can you talk a little bit about what led to that and what some of your experiences have been with that focus?
Yeah. Yeah, so the founder of Expert Dojo, Brian McMahon, looked around and saw that venture capital was broken, in that it really was about who you knew and were you guys with a hoodie and an idea in the Bay Area was what was getting funded at that time, and thought there's got to be a better way. And I think what he saw is that growth was the great equalizer, meaning that if you had a fast growing startup, then you could get funding even if you didn't look like the traditional founder, so to speak. And so that's why he founded and started Expert Dojo, was the concept of like, hey, if we really teach people how to growth hack, if we teach people how to get these fast growing startups, then they will get funding. And so the goal was to be able to fund just great diverse founders, not focused on their background, but focused on their execution and the fact that they could execute and grow companies. And so I'm really proud of our diversity metrics at Expert Dojo. And I think that within healthcare in particular, we funded 50% female and I believe 42% underrepresented, not female. I think that's, sort of speaks for itself in terms of the fact that we're able to find amazing founders that are not the typical funding metrics that are out there.
Kudos, music to my ears. How do you find these diverse founders, especially in your field?
Yeah, I would say that finding diverse founders is not an issue, meaning there's plenty of them out there. I think by nature of the fact that many of them do struggle to get the typical funding, we have a lot of different ways that we deal source. So we have a lot of referrals. So given the nature of working in industry for a number of years, essentially, we get people who refer companies into us. Some of them are through my personal networks that I have worked with a number of different universities, in particular, like places that are spinning out of innovation programs within universities are prime often for that. We have a number of other VC firms that refer people in. So, for example, they'll come to a VC firm and that VC firm will say, "You're not quite ready for us, but we think you would be perfect for Expert Dojo," and they can send them that way. And then my favorite way that we get referrals in is through other founders that we've worked with. So when founders who have gone through our program and benefited from us say, "You should take a look at this company. I think they're a great company. They'd be a great fit." Those are probably my favorite sources of referrals because we know immediately that we trust that founder as knowing what's the right timing and fit for us, but also that that's a good company and a good founder and that they're referring in.
Excellent. So this brings up a bigger question in terms of accelerators, and there's so many entrepreneur support organizations, so to speak. There are accelerators, there are incubators. Can you just take a step back and tell us what does an accelerator actually do, and how does it differ from something that an incubator does?
An accelerator, a good one, does exactly what its name says, right? It accelerates you on your journey. We like to say the companies we fund at Dojo would definitely get there without us. We just make the process faster. The goal of an accelerator is to help you move forward faster in your business. Typically, that means getting funding faster, creating certain milestones faster, or having access to the kinds of resources that would allow you to move faster in your business. An incubator typically tends to be a sort of much earlier kind of stage, and incubators tend to be also physically present. May or may not have a physical presence component to them. So, for example, Expert Dojo's accelerator is entirely virtual, but there are plenty of accelerators where they, for example, like Cedar Sinai has an accelerator in healthcare. You have to move to LA for that 3 month period and live and work and eat and breathe and be in the physical space, which works for some people, may or may not work for other people, in particular, potentially female founders that have families or have other responsibilities that would make it difficult for them to do that. So, an incubator tends to be more of like, for example, like a venture studio type of a thing where maybe people are putting money in, maybe they're not. I think the other thing to note is that some accelerators put money in, some don't. Some take equity, some don't. Some charge a fee and don't take any equity. So like there's all different ways in which accelerators can help support. And I think you're bringing up a great point, which is that you should really understand what the biggest needs are for your company and what that particular accelerator can offer. Because many or most of them will offer some kind of investment or funding. But as we like to say at Dojo, it's expensive money. So accelerator terms typically tend to be pretty steep in terms of what you might be able to raise from other investors. So you have to understand the value that they bring to the table.
So if I'm a starting entrepreneur, I have an idea. What are the questions I need to ask myself to say, is the right answer an incubator or is it an accelerator?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and especially in healthcare, this is a great question because there are such a variety of different kinds of startups that you could create. Some of them obviously have a requirement for a ton of funding or a lot more in funding or a lot more, for example, in research and development prior to being able to take it into the market. And unlike an app or a B2B software platform, people joke that you're supposed to move fast and break things, but like in healthcare, like that's typically not something that you can do because there's a regulatory component to it potentially. There are security components related to data in healthcare. So there's many different aspects. I think the best question to ask is number one, how much help support am I going to need to pull this idea together? So say I'm a clinician, for example, this happens all the time. I have an idea, I see this need in my practice and I say, wow, it would be amazing if I had this kind of a tool to support my patients. That's sort of like a very early stage. And likely what I would say for a company like that is see what support you have within your own institutions. If you're an academic institution, typically there's, for example, here in Portland, there's OHSU and they have programs internally to help support people that might have entrepreneurial ideas. I think the other thing that is really important to note and understand is the idea commercializable? Meaning, just because you have an idea, and even if that idea might help your patients or improve healthcare, doesn't necessarily mean it's something that could be adopted into the system. And so from a healthcare perspective, the thing that I would tell an early stage entrepreneur is see if you can find forms of non-dilutive funding, so grants or other things that can move your idea forward to a point in which you can be able to evaluate, okay, is this a feasible thing that people would pay money for, that I could commercialize, that would be adopted within whatever system, whether it's direct to consumer or direct into clinicians or within healthcare systems. And then I think the other side of that is depending on who you are as a founder, it's perfectly fine to be a quote unquote solo founder. There's nothing wrong with that. But I also think understanding who is that team that's going to help you bring this forward, because no one can really do this essentially on their own. So whether that's a university support team, whether that's, for example, bringing in outside contractors that have experience in a particular area in regulatory or some of these other things, but you really need to have that picture of what is it going to take to get this thing from my idea all the way through to like being a product or a service. And I think that's where having that clear roadmap and figuring out how much money is it going to take, how much time, what are my barriers, that sort of plan, or at least a very loose plan, is super important in the beginning. You can't really go out with just an idea on the back of a napkin, gets lots of money and turn it into a thing on the other side, as you might in maybe some other areas, consumer product or some of the other spaces. And I would say that the process is pretty much the same in most places, which is there an actual need for the thing that you're creating? Will people pay money for it? Do I have a team that can execute and actually bring this thing to fruition? And I think those are the three biggest questions that you have to ask yourself.
And that's a great point. And one thing I want to ask you specifically in the health, maybe less in the healthcare, more on the life sciences side, IP tends to be pretty important. So I'm seeing a juxtaposition where, on the one hand, IP is very important. And then, given where research is in your field, especially, a lot of it happens in universities by definition. And we have this third confounding factor that says women tend to file for fewer patents or fewer IP rights, so to speak, than men do. So how have you seen that play out in your experience, and what counsel would you give life sciences or more IP driven ideas?
IP is definitely very important in this space, and I think sometimes people also overestimate IP, meaning even great IP, if it doesn't have a commercializable plan behind it, it's only worth whatever somebody would pay to license it outside of you, right? Or if you have the ability to defend it, meaning if someone else can easily break the patent or go around it, do you really have the money to take on, especially a big player, for example, in that space? I was a part of a group that just started last year and now is continuing on, called the Women's Innovation Network out of University of Oregon. And I love what they're doing in that they're encouraging more women to file invention disclosures, and they're giving them the reasons behind it. I think one of the biggest things that happens to female faculty members is that on the tenure track, they have a lot of different things that are competing for their time. And they definitely typically tend to get more of the service type things put on them into their roles. And so they have all of these things that they're trying to juggle within their role: teaching, research, funding, etc. And I think this is not just a female faculty member thing. The innovation system in the US in particular is very broken in that what faculty is rewarded for in their day jobs versus the innovation side of it are very different things. So in some cases, the idea that you have more patents may or may not be good for you in your tenure, depending on how those things come about. But what I would say is this: get to know your tech transfer office, have an understanding of what that means. They typically tend to have classes or other things that help you understand what the process is to go through that. And I am a co-founder, a university spin out, and my co-founder is technical. She's faculty. She had never, I can guarantee you, she probably would not have gone through this process without me, not because she wouldn't have been interested, but because the barriers to sort of understanding all of the different steps that were involved would have been overwhelming. So I would say find a mentor or another faculty member that has been through this process that you can work hand in hand with, or find a co-founder that has interest in working with you on that. But the patent side of it is very important. And I faced this with one of the companies that I have funded, which is that please do not publish before you go out. And if you think you have something valuable, if you want to make a company, ensure that you're not publicly disclosing information about what it is that you're working on until you've had a chance to do an invention disclosure and file a provisional patent, because otherwise that is essentially public knowledge and then therefore invalidates any patent that you might have.
Great advice. So what I'm hearing, your advice on protecting your invention, focusing on the right things, extremely well taken. But the overarching advice or perspective I heard from you was make sure that the marketable potential is there above all from an entrepreneurial perspective, obviously. So that brings us back to yes, you assess the market potential and then you get in an accelerator. There are plenty of accelerators out there. There's clearly a sector focus, and then there are other types of accelerators, virtual, hybrid, blah, blah, blah. And then I've read some stuff around predatory accelerators to your own point about expensive money, right? What are the different types of accelerators and how should an entrepreneur think about picking the right one for them and essentially maximize the ROI on their effort in researching all of these accelerators and going through the competitive process and so forth?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that there's been an explosion in accelerators, honestly, like YC sort of invented this process and they did a great job in the beginning. And there is no dissing on any part of YC. I think that they have a brand that's very well recognized, that just being accepted as a YC founder gives you a certain amount of cachet. But I do think that it's going to depend on the stage of the company that you're at. So most accelerators operate in that early product market fit, figuring out who we are space. In that space, typically your valuation is probably already under 5 million as it stands right on the street. There are some people who think that their startups are worth more than that with just an idea and not much more. But I would say in those cases, accelerator terms tend to make sense. They're typically something like 100 to 150 for like 6%, 7% of the company. And really what they're doing is they're giving you an outside stamp of validation of the fact that they think that they're there, right? And they're going to help you put that picture together in a way that can help you sell that to the outside world. Often these accelerators are all about teaching you how to pitch and help support you in some other ways by providing a set of mentors that could be formally engaged with your company in different ways. I think the best way to research an accelerator is to understand where you're at in the time frame and what you need. Meaning, if what you really need, say you're a medical device startup, and what you really need is we don't know anything about regulatory. Like we've got the clinical side, we've got a clinical team, we've even maybe got an engineering team that can help support us, but we don't know anything about regulatory and we don't know what we don't know, right? We're still really early stage. There are places that you can go that are really great places that have that full picture. For example, MedTech Innovator is a great one that does that. They don't necessarily do funding, but they provide those guardrails. And so it really depends on where you're at. If you're further along, for example, and you have sales, you're already in sales and you're trying to grow, there are fewer accelerators that make sense at those times. Often the accelerators that I would recommend at those times, outside Expert Dojo, which is obviously a growth focused accelerator, would be ones that are very specific to your industry or your customer. For example, I know a company that has done an accelerator in the AARP aging space. And that made total sense because their target customer was in that space. And so the kinds of connections and mentors and customers and things that they can get connected to through there make total sense. So it's really about the stage and then also what it is that you need. There is something that we see, which is also accelerator hopping, which is like going from one accelerator to another and not raising any outside money is a big red flag for investors. I mean, many of the companies that we have funded out of Expert Dojo have participated in other accelerators. And we don't see that as a negative at all. We see that as like, okay, they went and they did this, they got this bit of knowledge, then they went out on their own and did a little bit more, and then they got some other outside investment, and now they're like, okay, we really need help in this area. It's hard to get help in that area, so we're going to go into this brand accelerator, or we're going to go into this. So it needs to make sense for the timing and what it is that you need. And then I would say the other thing, one of the best ways to figure out is go talk to some of the founders that have been through the program. And because I think that's honestly the best way to figure out whether or not it's worth it.
And how would you find out founders who have been through the program? I'm not sure if that's.
Yeah, that's actually pretty well. First of all, if they don't offer to introduce you to founders or they don't say you can talk to any of our founders, then that's a red flag. So you can find out they have their portfolios typically listed on their thing. You can reach out directly to founders or you can ask for introduction to founders. What we typically do is connect founders to other founders that would make sense for them. So, for example, we're in the health IT space, so I'm going to introduce you to another health IT founder that went through so that maybe you can relate, or perhaps it's another female founder, or perhaps it's another founder of color or another founder in Mexico, for example. Okay, you're in Mexico, we're going to introduce you to another founder that we work with in Mexico so you can understand that we can work with startups in that space. So I think I would definitely speak to other founders, and you can easily find them in their portfolio.
So you mentioned one red flag, which is if they're refusing to open the doors and tell you who the founders are, stay far away. Are there other red flags that you as a founder should watch out for when selecting a potential accelerator?
This is what I would say. I would say understand the process of how they are going to help you, meaning what is their either curriculum or process. I think asking them for their track record, meaning sometimes accelerators are new and they may not have a track record, but looking at who is going to be participating in that. Find out about their follow-on funding track record, I think is really important because, and I've seen this in some accelerators where they may not necessarily take equity, but they charge a fee, and then on the other side they don't really have a track record of actually supporting those companies. And so just like anything else, I mean, we sort of joke that there's a process like for Dojo where it's like getting engaged, right? And then like for those companies that move into Suncoast, it's like, yeah, we're getting married now, right? So of the companies that would flow from Dojo into Suncoast, it's not just about, do we like this company? Obviously we do, or we wouldn't have brought them into Dojo. We think that they have potential to be a unicorn, right? We think that they could be an amazing company. We recognize and understand that every company at that stage is going to have lots of warts and things under the covers, and you're dancing as fast as you can to go out and continue to keep moving things forward. I think personality and culture fit is a huge aspect of it. Do you actually like the people that you're going to be working with there? And that can be a harder thing, especially in some of these larger programs that run just like these big batches through. And that might be all you need. But I would say the other red flag is how many actual investors are they introducing you to? Or is it kind of a dog and pony show where just everybody shows up and it may or may not be helpful? And so I think asking the hard questions about that would be really important up front.
Excellent. One other question on accelerators from the selection side. I've heard two different points of view. One is this don't go anywhere near a pay to play accelerator. And then I've heard others that say, you know what, at least we're upfront, you know what you're paying, and we're not sucking it all at the back end with some low valuation and a very high percentage of the company. Do you have a take on that?
So, first of all, and I'm not going to go into dojo terms here, but what I would say is this is that there are accelerators that essentially rely on volunteers and or service providers to come in, and those service providers end up getting business off of those things, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's just you should be aware of the upfront side of that component of it. Here's what I have to say. In the end, it takes a village. You are going to have to give up equity to someone somewhere, and it's just a matter of, is there a value exchange that's worth it? They're not wrong to say, I'm going to pay these guys 10 grand. They're going to help me with X, Y, and Z. I do consulting. I help startup clients do that. We have very specific goals about what comes out at the end. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think that there are some that I have seen that operate as a sales machine, meaning they're just there to garner that. And then the quality of the programming and the value that comes out the other end is dubious. For us, the ones that fight it the least on like terms or even if it makes sense to is people who've done a startup before. So people who've done a startup before recognize that at some point in time, if you are going to be a venture-backed startup, you're going to give away equity. And like the longer that you hold on to the amount that you have or don't have, 100% of nothing is nothing, right? Like, and so like the question that you have to ask is this reasonable for the stage that we're at? By the way, you can push back. You can try to say what terms are negotiable, what terms are not negotiable. Asking all of those questions are really important too. And I think that I've seen people actively negotiate with accelerators. And if they really think that you're a great fit and they would love to see you in there, then I think that they tend to be pretty reasonable.
So flipping to the other side now, you've decided on an accelerator, they like you, you're in. As a founder, what should you do to maximize your value, the value that you get from being in this accelerator? What are the best practices? What should you be watching out for?
I think one of the questions that founders ask us is, can more of my team come participate? And we would say, heck yes. I don't know about other accelerators, but maximizing your time that you put in with also integrating that work back into the company is, I think, one of the biggest things that you need to do. If you do it in a vacuum, kind of like, I'm going to do this stuff over here and then everything else is going to run, I'm going to separate those things. I don't think that you're going to get the value out of it that you need or deserve. So we see companies that come in that give us that equity and then don't put in the work. And it's like, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So, like, if you're going to give up that equity for that investment, I would never go into an accelerator purely for the investment. 100%, you should never do that. You should do it because potentially the investment and the support of the stage that you're at. But if you're doing it only for investment, there are much cheaper, easier ways to get investment. And if you are not going to value the programmatic aspect of an accelerator, then you also should not do it. So I would say 100% participate. Be the squeaky wheel, be the one that always shows up also, because when you do that, you're going to be the one that gets the introduction. And then I would say also communicate on your end what your needs are and the things that you're looking to get out of it up front, because I think those are going to be important for the people that are running the accelerator to understand.
One clarifying point on that, I've talked to a couple entrepreneurs, and there's this tension between I want to learn everything I can possibly learn by being in the accelerator, but then I've got a business to run and I only have 24 hours in a day.
You have the same problem that everybody else does. 100%. We totally get it. It's not like anyone else is in any different of a position, right? Like everybody that's participating in that. And that's why I say you have to lean on co-founders or lean on other key staff. For example, if there's a marketing component to the accelerator curriculum, let your marketing person, if you have one of those, be the lead in that aspect of it and ask them to integrate it into the rest of the company and the way that you're doing it. You should also look at like the demands of the accelerator, right? If it's in person and you're required to physically move somewhere and do those things, that you have to really carve out to say like, okay, these are the things that I'm putting on the back burner for now, and these are the things that I'm focusing in on, and this is the reason why I'm choosing to do that. And this is going to move me forward, but it's going to feel like I'm taking a little bit of a standstill or a step back. The goal would be that as you come out, you jump forward in a number of different ways. And there are some things that you can put a little bit of a pause on, and there are some things that you can't. And you have to decide, because I think that's something that we hear a lot from our founders. For example, if they've got an investor meeting, if they got something else going, we hope that they will schedule them in times that are not, but we understand. That's something that we see all the time, and we don't have an issue with that. But it's a matter of if you're just genuinely not participating or applying what we're supporting you with, then you're going to get out of it what you put in. You're going to end up in the same place that you were when you started, or worse.
Good point. So you mentioned this point about the fact that you make introductions, or an accelerator makes introductions to investors. What should a founder watch out for, and how does the accelerator, or how should the accelerator support an entrepreneur in negotiating with an investor?
It's going to depend on the accelerator. I mean, some of them don't do any of that. Like they may or may not introduce you. They may only just do a demo day in which you meet investors there or you don't, and those investors reach out to you or they don't. I would say Expert Dojo has an entire investment team, and we make direct introductions for our founders. We, Genevieve and I, will help our startups with thinking about terms and looking at things. We're not lawyers. You should absolutely have a lawyer and somebody that is within your company that understands these things. But one of the biggest things that I see founders do that drive me absolutely crazy is that they set up on their end non-standard terms. They create some crazy note that has weird terms in it that is not standard, and then they wonder why people are pushing back on it or investors are wrong. What to look out for there is just understand that there's different qualities of investors, meaning they could be angels, they could be early stage VC funds, and typically when you're looking at these, that's what it is, because you're in an accelerator environment. Just vet the investors yourself too. And if you have a weird feeling about whether or not there's genuine interest or there's something else going on, then report that back to the accelerator, for example, because most of them are genuinely trying to only introduce accredited investors that. And then the other thing I would say is, especially in healthcare, sometimes what will happen is like it's a big group and you're going through with a bunch of different companies, and maybe there's tech companies and fintech companies and healthcare, and then everybody's there. So one of the biggest things to ask or look out for is, do the investors invest in your industry? Because usually a fintech investor is not going to invest in healthcare. and vice versa. There are some crossovers. We've had some companies that are both blockchain and healthcare. And it's tricky, right? Because they actually have genuine like blockchain investors, and then the healthcare investors are like struggle with the blockchain side, and the blockchain struggle with the healthcare side. So better understanding who your target investor is and understanding whether they have connections into those, I think would also be really helpful, rather than, I don't know if there's a particular red flag on investor, but you should have a very clear process of what their investment process is, like how many meetings are you going to have, what kind of checks do they write, asking similar questions as before, who have they invested in previous to now. So I think sometimes startups forget to ask. It's kind of like being on the other end of a job interview. Startups should do a lot more asking of the other side of investors as well, because there are plenty of people writing checks. And if money is the only thing that you need, like we joke about like having smart money, sort of neutral money, and then dumb money. And there is dumb money, which is like money that you're going to regret later, which is like somebody who is doing this because they're fascinated with startups and just wants to like talk to you 24/7. And now they're your investor and you have to, so like, what are the boundaries? And so there is money like that too. Or people who don't really understand what investing is or how risky being an angel investor is. And so I think it's important to vet that these are people who genuinely understand the process. And I probably, as a startup, wouldn't take angel investment from somebody that hadn't done it before, or that it didn't at least have the education to understand what it was about.
Very good points. And on this specific thing I have in terms of getting investment and negotiating, I have one question for you, particularly because we are focused on women and diverse entrepreneurs. I've read some research that says that women in particular end up getting smaller size checks at a lower valuation for a bigger part of the company. To what extent have you seen that happen? And what advice or tips would you offer to women entrepreneurs in terms of negotiating better terms, whether it covers valuation or the share of equity or what, anything that covers the overall economics and deal terms?
I think it's no different than, for example, the reason why I think a lot of the disparity in the pay is about not pushing back and counter offering. I mean, I'm lucky to say, like, I feel like my daughter's generation, they do that. But there was a cultural and a sort of mediocre males would push back on salary offers, whereas stellar, outstanding women wouldn't necessarily, because it was not seen as nice. There was an aspect of it that was sort of like culturally gender specific. I think the same is true potentially with investors, meaning maybe the reason for that is because probably males tend to push back more. Meaning, if you don't think an offer is fair, gut check it with some other people who are friendly to you and your startups and understand whether or not, and then counter. I've had people just walk away without countering, and sometimes that's super frustrating, because we would have absolutely negotiated if they didn't think that it was fair, if they had reasons why. So that's the other side of that coin. Don't just push back and say, I don't think that's fair, or this is what I think is fair. Then you need to come with the receipts, which is like, this is why it's fair because X, Y, and Z, and this is where, and that's all that they want to see. And then they'll either make a choice to invest or not. But the idea that you would just literally walk away without countering, which I have seen more from women than men, that's what leads me to believe that there's an aspect of it that has to do with, there may be an aspect of it about pushing back and requesting what you want.
So if I'm hearing you right, I think what I heard you say was that they would rather walk away from a deal than face the discomfort or the gender violation, norm violation of saying, hey.
Well, and I think here's the thing, and I'm sure that there are times that they maybe get lowballed compared to a male founder. Like, I think this is always the case when you're a woman or you're a person of color. You don't know whether the behavior is that's how they treat everybody, or is this specifically happening to me because of who I am. And I've been in that situation in a career position, and I had to go ask my male, like, is this how he is with everybody? Or is he treating me like a 5-year-old because that's how he treats everybody? Or is that specific to me because I'm a woman and he's not? And so I don't know. I don't know if there's data around that. There's data that they've done around like housing discrimination and other things where it's like people with the exact same application. I think men typically tend to push back more easily, meaning like it's more ingrained in maybe the way that they were raised to believe was acceptable. And I don't know. Like I said, I feel grateful. My daughter's 27 and has zero problem with negotiating her salary and literally hardballing it. I mean, like, I'm glad because that is something that I think has traditionally held us back in getting salaries that we deserve. There's absolutely bias. There's absolutely offers that come in that should be the same that are not. And I think that the same is probably true in venture. And the other side of that coin is that the other thing that I see sometimes from female founders, it's not a lack of confidence in themselves. It's the way that they present their startup is Genevieve says all the time, they're pitching a popsicle stand and they have a rocket ship. So the way that they position or how they talk about the opportunity, often there's a disparity in what we see male founders do and what female founders. Female founders tend to be more realistic and present this is the business and this is how it's going to grow. And male founders are like, we're going to be a unicorn or we're going to do this and we're going to do. And so the way that people are talking about their business also affects the kind of offers that they get for investment. And so that may also be some component of that. Yeah, I think pushing back is the best thing that I would say. And also finding investors that are aligned with you. I very rarely have seen, and I know that there are some, I'm aware of them, people who genuinely do this to female founders. I don't send any of my founders to those places. I know some of them that I'm like, yeah, no, I would never send a female founder there.
What I'm taking away is number one, always advocate for yourself. Push back. You're going to lose nothing. And look really hard at what you're selling. Is it a popsicle stand to your point, or is it a rocket ship that's hiding under the.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So, just moving on to the other side of your life, which is the venture side. Can you talk a little bit about Suncoast, what got you involved in that, and what you're hoping to accomplish there?
Sure. So just to be clear too, Expert Dojo is actually venture as well. So we have a fund and we invest in companies and then we follow on invest in companies. So we are making investment decisions there. And I got involved in Suncoast as an emerging manager. So I'm managing director of Suncoast Ventures and it's an emerging VC firm. We look to support startups that are in the healthcare space. So it's very aligned with what Expert Dojo is doing. And typically those founders are going to be people who have come through Expert Dojo. So this is not a sort of separate deal in the sense that one of the things that's tremendous and amazing about being able to work with companies at Expert Dojo is that, as I mentioned before, we get to see what's under the covers. We get to work with them in long tail diligencing. We get to really understand who could use the type of support that Suncoast could offer or not. And then also if these are the founders that we would want to work with. So one of the things that I think is interesting, it's like dating and marriage, as we talked about before, like everybody can be on their best behavior, for a little bit of time. And then you start to see the stuff that is underneath the covers. And I think that from the Suncoast side, for me, it just made a natural fit in terms of we as a firm want to be a value add group. We want to be able to look at it from a perspective of, is there a fit? Is there a match? Does that match make sense for what it is that we have outlined and how we want to support startups? And then is the timing right? So that's the other component of it. And I think this is really hard for startups sometimes to understand is like, sometimes the timing is just off. They'll say to me when they come from Expert Dojo, I talked to this fund, thought things were going really well. And then I hear, we're interested, keep in touch with us, but the timing isn't right now. And that's a classic sort of VC sort of brush off. Sometimes what that means is, I really like you. When you get to this place, I'll consider funding you. Sometimes that just means no. And it's hard to know. But until you hear an actual no, you can always continue on that conversation. But what I would say is this, like getting involved for me in Suncoast is about supporting entrepreneurs. So being able to be there to help them and to be able to have somebody in venture that is there that they can tell the bad stuff to and say, like, I really need help with this. Because I do think a lot of founders think that they have to only show their good side or their face that gets them checks in the door, and then all the other stuff they have to shove under the couch cushions, and they have to only show that side. And I think being able to be the kind of VC firm that cares about founders and wants to make an impact in the world, not just from returns, which every VC firm wants to see, but from the human impact in supporting founders, as well as like global impact from a healthcare perspective.
Very interesting point you mentioned, like the time is not right? I've heard I've had the pleasure of talking to so many amazing people for my podcast, and I've definitely heard the theme that if they say that, that's a no. Anything that's not, when is the next meeting and can we have it tomorrow? And everything else is a no. So, how do you
Yeah.
tell the difference?
Yeah, you can tell the difference. So it depends on where the firm is at. If they're actively deploying checks and they have capital to deploy, you should ask them what kind of KPIs would you like to see before I come back and try to re-engage you again. What are you looking for? Meaning, can you give me some guidance or insight into, it sounds like timing is off. That may be because they've already allocated the investment that they want to do into healthcare this year, or it may be that they like what you're doing, but they want to see a little more traction before they come into you. So you can try. I have learned as being on the other end, because I have told founders from Expert Dojo that we're not going to invest in them. And basically, if you tell them the truth, they can come back and try to argue you. Like they can basically, but yeah, but this, but that, and it's like once you've made that decision, you've made that decision. So I would say until you hear a no, it's not a no. But you should get some guidance into, because I have founders that literally think that because a venture fund has not emailed them back to a response of setting up a meeting, that's a no. They're busy, they're overloaded, it's hard for them to gauge all of these things. And so until you hear you're not a fit, if you hear you're not a fit for our fund, and that makes sense. And that's something that actually I think more founders need to do. I get emailed all the time to Suncoast Ventures about people wanting me to look at their startup, and it's not even in healthcare. And I'm like, did you even look? So again, are you a fit for their thesis? All of these things. There may be other reasons why they pass on you. There's another investment in their portfolio that's too close to you. And so they couldn't feel like they could support you because they would be directly competitive with a company they've already invested in. Number one. Number two, it could be that, like I said, the timing's just not right. They're like, we like them, but we typically invest closer to this stage when a company has done this much revenue or this much whatever. So I would try to suss out what is the reasoning behind it when they say the timing's not a fit. And you can say something to the effect of, what would you like to see in growth metrics or whatever those things are for me to come back around?
One other question, which you may or may not have a perspective on, is I've talked to some diverse founders, women, and one thing they've expressed some frustration with is the typical answer any VC gives me is, oh, go attend some more training, go to another accelerator. But it's always just a way of deflecting that they don't or won't invest in us. To what extent do you think this is prevalent? And if so, what can a founder do to ensure that they're allocating their very, very precious time into what matters to get their business moving forward?
Oh, so like they're meeting some kind of quota? Is that what you're thinking? Like, I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking about those metrics. I mean, I think there's a double-edged sword too, right? Funds that are solely focused on investing in women or people of color, their portfolios are visible. You can go look at who they've invested in, or you can ask them about their investment portfolio. I think that they're not going to probably waste your time past a second meeting. And I do think that one of the best things that comes out of like Expert Dojo's cohorts is that those folks bond with each other and they share information. So like a lot of this information is sort of readily available. There are some funds that are literally so painful because they take so long to make decisions. So again, the more information that you can get about processes and like how many meetings and what kind of gauntlet do I have to run through in order to get across to a check. But on the other side of it, as being somebody who has to do that component of the diligence and all of those things, like there are a lot of things that have to be done that have to get lined up, that check boxes have to get made. And some of it has nothing to do with you. Some of it just has to do with the ways that they're balancing all the things that they're doing. So they're supporting current portfolio companies. They're doing all of that, doing the meetings and all of these things. And so figuring out how their process works. But I think it also depends on who you're talking to. If you're just talking to a junior associate, there's nothing wrong with that. But that person likely has no voice in the investment committee decisions. And so I think it's a typical front gate door thing, but better understanding who it is that you're talking to and whether or not they have investment decision. Don't dismiss them. you wouldn't anything else, but just know what you're getting into. I don't know if there's like a list somewhere of the funds that are doing that. I wish, but there are lists in places what funds have supported female founders. One of the things that I would say is it's a tricky fine line, because if you box yourself into being a fund that supports diversity lens, then often people don't think that you are investing for returns. And so it can become a tricky thing.
And you brought up a really good point about junior analysts and the deal working its way through the python, so to speak. So for those of our founders who may not be as familiar, would you mind giving a quick overview of what actually happens when a VC fund actually invests in a startup? What's that process look like?
It depends on how big the fund is. If it's a small fund, you're probably going to be talking to the principals. You might be talking to a scout who is just vetting checkboxes. They're going to be looking for the things that I mentioned before in terms of what is it that they're looking for. Is this a big market? Like, one of the other things that they're looking for, and we're often looking for, is this a unique idea? Meaning there's not 200 other people competing in this exact, like, it's not overly saturated, overly crowded, right? There's like a sweet spot between nobody's in it, so why is nobody in it, to like everybody's in it, and now it's impossible to compete in. There's a window there. Is this a team that can execute and take that across the line? And I think one of the biggest reasons why women have been discriminated against in venture is because there's a lot of pattern matching going on. And the pattern matching goes something like this. If this person's had a successful startup before, they get 5 extra points. If they have put in their own money and they bootstrapped it until this point, they get another. If they're successfully raised, there's so some of the reasons why women may have been excluded for funding, some of it is just pure discrimination. Some of it is pattern matching, meaning, I don't know, I've never seen a founder like this before that is coming from this background. And then they're going to be looking for the things that show them that you are going to execute, that you're going to drive forward, that you're going to take this company forward no matter what, because they know that you're going to have bumps along the way, and they want to see that. And lastly, and I cannot stress this enough, they're looking for your coachability. So coming off as arrogant or as if you can't hear advice from other people. That being said, I've also seen founders that are getting like conflicting advice from 20 different places and trying to sort those out. It's up to you to take in that advice, put it through your own filter and say, does that resonate with me or not? Right? Does that make sense or not? So the process is typically first meeting, first call. You will know very quickly if it's no. Usually, like if it's a hard no, if it's just, oh my gosh, you're way too early. And I see this a lot at Expert Dojo. You're not in revenue yet. You're not really even close to having a product finished yet. Like, check back with me when you do. I'd love to talk to you. And then there's some where it's, I need to dive a little deeper. I need to understand a little bit more. So a second meeting with a venture fund, the first meeting is really those top line things of like, is there a big enough market for this company? Does this seem like there's some kind of product market fit signals, whether they're selling or not? Does the team look like it's a good team and it's going to be able to execute on this? And is this a fit for our fund? Meaning, if you are a later stage healthcare company and you're pitching an early stage fintech, then it's not a fit. Even if it's a cool company and they would love to fund you, like, it's not a fit. So the second meeting is typically diving in more with founders, getting to know them personally, getting to dive into some questions. You should be able to come with, again, the receipts. So like, why do you say that this is this kind of market? Why do you think that you're going to beat your competitors? Who are competitors? Diving into all of those, maybe even picking through them. And depending on the amount of the check and what it is, there could usually is at least a third meeting. That may often include your team members. They may want to meet your other founders, not just the main founder, the technical team, for example. They might be a technical diligence. We do that. We do a clinical diligence. So we'll bring you and put you in front of a founder that's a doc that understands how to commercialize technology in healthcare, and they're going to ask the hard clinical questions about your product if that's relevant. So there could be 4 to 5 diligence calls, but I think the biggest thing for me to emphasize with founders is that you should be asking questions along the way as well. What is the next step in the process? When will I hear from you? Like, all of those things. And I don't think any VC is ever being malicious when they don't get back to a startup when they say they're going to. Could be a variety of different reasons. And again, continue to be diligent on your end. And in particular, as you reach out, it's always great to give them good news about, hey, I just wanted to follow up. I had a great discussion. We still think you're a great fit. By the way, we just signed another customer, or we just brought in another 250K in funding. We'd love to have you in on that round. Whatever that is that you can also re-engage them with positive, I think is important. And then in the end, they're going to ask you for your data room. They're going to go through it. Some are going to go through it more than others. There may be things that are missing that they want to see, so they're going to ask you for those things. So having all of that in line up front, I think, is important. And so a data room usually consists of all the things that are more in detail, like all the contracts that you have out or the cap table, etc. Next step, when things are moving forward, would be to get to a term sheet, which is non-binding on both sides, but you've kind of agreed on what you're going to do. And then the final step is signing the note or the safe, or if it's an equity investment, then signing those documents and then wiring money. And everybody takes longer for each one of those steps. And there's lawyers involved, and it's not as fast as an angel investment. If you want fast investment, go to angels.
But only the right ones.
Yes, only the right ones. Yes, I would agree with that.
Absolutely. So this has been a fantastic discussion. So if you had to conclude, wrap up, and say 5 things to do for a founder to make sure she has an investable venture, what would those 5 things be? Like, what should she focus on?
The first one is ensuring that you have product market fit, or that you can justify that you do in some kind of metrics there, even if you're at an early stage that you think that you do. I think the other is really about the team that you've built and whether or not that team brings to value and really amplifies what you bring to the table. And really understanding yourself as a founder is probably one of those, meaning if you're not an operations person, ensure that you find an operations person on your team, because that's going to be really critical. For example, if you are a technical founder, finding somebody that has the business acumen or support. Another thing would be to find mentors who've been there, done that. That's super critical. I mean, I just got the first outside funding for my startup. I write checks to startup and make funding decisions on the other side, but it's being on that side of the fence, like having people that you can bounce ideas off of and get good advice from. So surround yourself not just with a good team, but also good advisors and mentors who have, for example, been there, done that, and understand this process better than you do, so that you can get their insight and advice. And then lastly, I would say, make sure that you know how to tell a good story. Ultimately, the people that get funded are the ones that can tell the best story. And it's because of the full picture, right? It's all the things that I mentioned. We're a great team. We've got a big market. We've got this cool thing that no one else has, and we're going to make all of the things. But that's out of your comfort zone and you're the CEO, then you need to seek support, whether that is from founders groups that might be free, or whether that's from hiring a pitch coach or somebody that can help you gain the kind of ability that you would need in order to get that across. And so I think that being able to tell the story, there's no one that's going to be able to tell your story better than you can, but not everybody is as comfortable in that. And so making sure that you have all the fundamentals is important. And then you do need that extra aspect of being able to come across with the story in a way that's, because people fund who they remember. It's the truth. It's like, if you're listening to this many pitches a day, if they don't remember you, even if they thought they're like, oh yeah, that was kind of good. Why didn't we follow up with that? It's because it's like, if they don't remember it, it's not going to happen. So I think really making sure that you have the ability to come through with that story.
Fantastic. This has just been an outstanding conversation, Charla. I just can't tell you how enjoyable and informative it's been. So thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Charla was an incredibly interesting guest to talk to, not only because she's so engaging, but also because she's such a wealth of information and practical wisdom for all founders, but especially for women in STEM and life sciences. My first big takeaway from this conversation is that you should, at all times, have a very precise understanding of exactly what your startup needs at this point in terms of expertise and resources. And you should also update this view often, because things change so fast. If you try to chase too many things, or the wrong thing for your startup at this point in time, you'll not only waste precious time, but you'll also risk giving away too much of your company for too little in return. So, be very surgical about what your startup needs next. Second, there's a big difference, especially in tech and STEM fields, between a great product and a highly marketable one. Do you know the difference? And is your product not only great, but also actually marketable? Will someone pay good money to buy it? Last but not least, be very careful and clear about what you will give and what you will get in return when you're engaging with any entity to help you with the launch of your startup. Promises that may look great on paper may not translate into anything worthwhile in reality. Talk to people with experience to get a true picture of what's likely to happen. And most of all, never walk away from something you like without negotiating, even if negotiating scares the daylights out of you. So, what is the one area of your startup that needs a deep dive and a sharper look right now? And what will you do to get it done? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's ACHIIV.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.